All right, this is a video on how does a muscle contract going all the way from the brain, spinal cord, out to the muscle. And I got several models here to work with you guys. But the first thing we're gonna start with is the brain. So there's a spot on the brain called the precentral gyrus. And you can see it right here in red. Now there's neurons in there, axons, and they basically correspond to different areas of the body. So for example, there's a spot on this brain for the forearm and the hand and the back and the legs, and corresponding to actual muscles. But in the brain, from that precentral gyrus, like this, it sends a signal, action potential signal, down the brain, out to the thalamus, down the brainstem, and then down the spinal cord itself, like this. Now this is traveling on what's called the corticospinal tract. So it's traveling down, and eventually it's gonna leave the spinal cord and make its way out to the muscle. For that, let's come down here and look at this model. So the corticospinal tract would actually be inside the spinal cord, traveling vertically down from the brain, and then at some point it's got to make the decision to travel out. And that's going to depend on where you're at in the body, right? If you're at the shoulders, or if you want to go to the legs, you got to go lower, right? Shoulders higher, legs lower. So depending on that level of the spinal cord, if I bring it over to the skeleton, spinal cord's in here. So imagine these nerves, spinal nerves, branching off every level as you come down. So for example, let's say we want to go to the arm. Now the arm has a bunch of nerves right here where you can see them coming off down there. But what's the branch from the spinal cord itself? Well, notice there's two roots right here, and motor information comes out of this anterior root. We also call that the ventral root, coming out to the spinal nerve, which would be this spot right here. And then if you want to go posterior, you're going to take the posterior rami or dorsal rami. If you want to go anterior or lateral, you're going to take the anterior or ventral rami. So one of those two continues to extend out, and those might merge into more nerves, but that's info for another video. But eventually the nerve is going to get down to the level of the muscle, right? So this one right here, it looks like it's stopping right at the brachialis muscle, which would be something like this. If you take a chunk of muscle, this is a muscle fiber. And within a muscle fiber, you have a bunch of myofibrils, which have myofilaments, which include the sarcomere, which is from here to here, which has these actin and myosin. We'll get to this model over here with the red actin and the blue myosin. But for now, how about the nerve? The action potential is coming down the nerve and getting to the end of the axon. Now there's these little vesicles that have acetylcholine inside, a neurotransmitter that's going to help communicate that action potential into the muscle. There's also mitochondria and a nucleus. Well, the acetylcholine is released across the synaptic cleft onto what's called the motor end plate. Motor end plate is part of the muscle that receives that acetylcholine. The acetylcholine would activate the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And imagine this stuff all throughout the muscle, right? It's over here as well as over here. The model just shows it well on this side, but you can see it in here as well. Well, the sarcoplasmic reticulum has these little ends that bubble up called the terminal cisternae. And notice the blue thing in the middle? That's called a transverse tubule, or T tubule. And through a series of receptors and channels, you're going to activate calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now there's a little bit of a triad going on here between two terminal cisternae and the T tubule. But the main thing to know is that calcium is released. Where is it released to? Well, it's released over to the sarcomere, where the actin and the myosin is. So again, this is a Z disc, thin and thick filaments, but let me bring you over to the final model, the sarcomere model, one of my favorite models in lab, to teach you guys what actually happens. So calcium would be floating in, and it would connect to these green things called troponin. Troponin would then activate this yellow thing, tropomyosin, to move. Now it moves out of the way of the actin, which is the red. And specifically, there's some myosin binding sites on here. But a better way to show you all this is to show you on the whiteboard. And this is what's called the sliding filament theory. So remember that actin? Now it's green. Tropomyosin is blue. And normally, the tropomyosin covers up the myosin binding sites. See those little dots that are covered up in the middle of the circles? Those would be myosin binding sites. Here's the myosin, ready to attach to the actin. However, it's covered, it's blocked. You need something to unblock the tropomyosin. That's where calcium comes in. In the presence of calcium binding to the troponin, it moves the tropomyosin. See how the blue is now moved out of the way, and the myosin head can attach to the myosin binding site on actin. Now we got ADP here, which is energy, ready to be released and do what's called a power stroke. Power stroke is when the myosin head bends like that and it pulls like a rope on the actin. And then you release that energy. That would be like, over here on the model, the pulling, like let me try to pull here. Pull and pull and pull. There we go. Pull, pull, pull. Power stroke, power stroke, power stroke, power stroke, till the muscle shortens and contracts. Well, that's only half of the story. How do you unhook the binding? You bring in more energy in the form of ATP. And that's going to unbind the myosin head from the actin. The tropomyosin is going to slide back over. Notice how from here the binding site is open, but here it's closed. Well, break down ATP and you load the myosin head, or you cock it back, but we still don't have those myosin binding sites. Remember what happened first? That calcium came in, it binds, release the energy, power stroke, more energy, it unhooks, break that down, it cocks back, calcium binds, releases again and again and again until you get that full contraction of a muscle going from here to here. And this has been your video on how does a muscle contract, starting in the brain, going down the spinal cord, going out to muscle, going into the muscle fiber, and eventually doing the sliding filament theory of the sarcomere. Let me know what questions you have, and thanks for watching.